The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Whoever had carved the door relished in the anatomy of suffering. It was a 2-story tall slab of copper set directly into a cavern wall, its surface carved with a vast and complex bas-relief that worried the eye, a cloying, confusing mix of human bodies sprawling upwards in a mound of naked flesh, many glancing horrified over their shoulders while fleeing something out of frame and out of sight, thousands of them, starved and wretched with gaunt faces and sunken eyes, jutting ribs and distended bellies. There were rumors that they moved, but only when you weren't looking. Less than a week after its discovery, they brought it down with explosives. We didn't really know what we'd found at that point, although I'm sure a few of us, particularly the religious, had their suspicions. The door was wrong. All wrong. It just shouldn't have been there. Natural caverns don't go that deep in Britain. Not 1,000 meters. As scientists, we should have been excited, but we all agreed the door was repulsive. Staring at it too long induced a powerful urge to flee, an ancestral memory, maybe. The same way our bodies know to avoid things that crawl and slither, things that rot and buzz and stink of death and decay. They never told us how or why they found it, nor why the project was classified, only that we had to figure out what was on the other side. When the charges finally blew, they went off like giant firecrackers, a string of them that ran around the gateway, one by one, deafening booms that shook the entire cavern. I was left blinking dust out of my eyes as great machines lowered the door, now free of its couplings, to the ground. Looking back, some details come easier than others. The air that wafted out was hot and dry, and I was not surprised. That seemed intuitively correct, whether I'd admitted it to myself or not. The fact was, I'd been thinking of the door as a gateway to hell pretty much since I'd first laid eyes on it. And my mental image of hell was oddly medieval. I expected great big stone walls, something reminiscent of an ancient castle, rattling chains, the wailing of the damned, the stench of sulfur, God, even little red devils with horns and pointy tails. But I hadn't expected shelves and books. That was the first real thing we saw. Shelves lining the walls that had been dug directly into the same rock as the cavern, shelves that rose far above our lights, so that when we looked up, there was only darkness and dust, but no limits to the endless row and row of shelving. Every last inch covered in books. There were no gaps, just dust and tattered spines of random sizes, leather, fabric, paperback, faded pastels and gold leaf letters in alphabets both familiar and strange. And it wasn't just the walls. The floor was littered with random head-high piles of books, all stacked up like some tired librarian had gotten fed up of finding room for them. They made a labyrinth of the place, obscuring corners and doors, and the forward team, myself included, progressed carefully along the stone passageway, listening and looking carefully for some signs that would make sense of the place. There must have been thousands of books, and that was just in the first hallway we explored. Whenever we took one out, we found paper so thin it was nearly translucent, and often inked with strange shapes and letters I couldn't recognize. Otherwise, it was gibberish. Not that we studied them too long on that first day. Whenever I took one, I returned it quickly, lifting them up. I always had the strangest sensation that I was doing something wrong, inappropriate, and I didn't like the space they left behind on the shelves. A gap like a missing tooth. The darkness within swirling like deep waters. Safety in that place felt like an illusion, and touching the books was at risk of shattering it. I don't know how else to put it, except I didn't want to do anything that might draw attention to me. It was as if we were extremely conspicuous. There were no sounds but those we made, our own breath, our own footfalls, the shuffle and scuffle of our every movement. We could even hear each other's heartbeats, the discordant bump of several people's chests beating like a broken drum set, and every now and again, a racing, a steady increase in the beat's cadence as we turned a blind corner, or lifted a book just to see what it contained, or looked up at the shadows above us. Each of us kept having false starts because there was always this expectation that you were going to see something. Soon, any second now, squeezed between two books, or dangling overhead. It took 6 more hours before that corridor opened up, and when it did, we were dumbfounded. We emerged onto a vast and terrifying mezzanine made of ancient rock, overlooking a chasm with no visible bottom, just floor after floor filled with shelves filled with books. Millions, billions, and all along those distant walls and stories were little openings that led to more corridors like the one we'd just emerged from. So many that it was like staring at a roughshod beehive. To look up or down or anywhere was to be faced with more books than anyone could read in their entire lifetime. We took our first break on that mezzanine, while radios didn't go very far in that place. We'd had the sense to carry enough wire to allow for a hard connection, and using that we contacted the main research site and updated them on the situation. We were to keep going for another 6 hours and turn around. A day, no more, was the plan. Even that felt like too long. I wanted to leave. I wanted to confirm that somewhere was a doorway that would lead back to reality, because ever since I'd entered that place, it felt like I'd entered a nightmare, a place where reality was plastic. I told myself it was simply the scale of it all, the weirdness, but it was more than that. The very air down there felt thin. There were 6 of us, 3 scientists and 3 soldiers. The soldiers responded to the situation with silence and an alertness that bordered on paranoia, constantly scanning the dark with their rifle-mounted lights, flicking the beam from one high-up shelf to another, fidgeting, exchanging dark looks. In a way, I was thankful, but it put me on edge too, and I couldn't relax at all for the first half of our little break. I guess it was natural that the scientists got talking. This was partly to fill the quiet, but also partly to try and convince ourselves we were excited about the implications of this find, whatever those may be. Rewriting history, archaeology on a new level, that kind of thing. It didn't take long before we convinced ourselves to take a closer look at those books. I'll admit it didn't come easy, but we did a pretty good job of convincing ourselves that we weren't really afraid. We started slowly, taking one book down, opening and then quickly replacing it. But then with false bravery, we took more and more came down until each of us was Saturday, cross-legged with several books stacked up on either side, waiting to be read. I remember at some point I must have grown tired and looked up from my own pile, because I noticed Dr. Eisling muttering quietly as she traced some words with her fingers. "What have you found?" "It's Latin alphabet," she said. First one I actually recognized the letters for. German, maybe. None of us were linguists, so we were simply doing our best. But upon hearing B mention German, one of the soldiers came over and looked at the open page. "Germanic, but not German," he said. "You speak it." He nodded. "My father is German, and I don't know what that is. But it isn't German. Is any of it familiar?" Bay asked while handing the book to him. After a brief nod from his Elte Michael, he took it and began flicking through the pages. "I think this is the word for death. A sort of rough misspelling, maybe. This one is, I guess it's a bit like wanting, desiring. I don't know. Not all of the words seem like they're in the right context either. So they're in a variety of languages and alphabets, but as of yet nothing we can make sense of. What about you? Any luck?" B asked me, and I looked down at the book currently open in my hands. Some kind of Cyrillic, maybe. I shrugged. I'm no linguist. We definitely need Dr. Sellers on the next expedition. I'm sure he could offer some insight. What about you, Dr. Rosenstein? The third scientist in our group, a little bald man, had been sitting quietly the entire time we spoke, frowning at one of several books that lay open before him. I assumed he was just curious. "Like B and I." "Grant," I said, trying to get his attention. "Hey, Grant, have you found anything?" His silence unnerved me. He wasn't just captivated. Sweat was prickling his forehead, and veins bulged along his temple. He had gone pale, and his eyes were wide and his lips cracked and dry. The soldiers, picking up on the same strange signals I had, stood a little more upright. "Dr. Rosenstein," one of them asked nervously. "Doctor, can you hear us?" The nearest soldier reached out and placed a hand on Grant's shoulder, and the little man looked up at us like he hadn't even realized we existed until that moment. At first I thought he was relieved, the way he stared at each of us with a dumb grin on his face, but I soon realized something wasn't quite right. "Oh," he said with an anxious laugh. "Oh, right, of course." His eyes darted between us. "Of course. Sorry, I didn't mean to alarm you." "Right," I said. "Well, we were just talking about the books. B thinks hers might be in a kind of German or Germanic language." He nodded like this made perfect sense. "Yes, I imagined so," he replied while looking around the shelves that towered over us. "Lots of languages, I'd say. And then, without really missing a beat," he added, "their sins." The group fell into silence as each of us tried to make sense of what he'd just said. In the meantime, he stood up and stretched, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "What are you on about?" I said once it became clear he wasn't going to elaborate. "It's fairly obvious where we are," he said while leaning forward and eyeing us darkly. "And these books are a list of all our sins, one for each of us, so there will be books in German, both contemporary and historic German, like the one you found, Dr. Eisling, but there'll also be books in Russian and French and Arabic and Chinese, not just contemporary tongues either, ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, Babylonian, Aramaic, Latin, and of course, lost languages, ones that we never found but existed anyway. All of them, all the transgressions of the world are right here, recorded in the sinner's original tongue." By now, the soldiers had stepped a little closer, and Bay and I were sharing deeply worried looks. Grant seemed to be in the middle of a breakdown, speaking frantically and anxiously, convinced of his own meaning while not really saying anything of sense. "Grant, I think we need to go, but the real fun is that I think you'll find books in languages that don't exist yet," he blurted. "This isn't just a record of sins in the past, but all of them, every last one, even the ones we haven't committed yet. Grant, I'm going to have one of the men go back with you, if that's okay. I think you might not. These are mine," he said while gesturing to the book in his hand. "All of them," he laughed. "Not just the things I did. Petty transgressions all recorded with names and places and even little diagrams. But there are even sins I only ever thought. Things I wanted to do. And," he added while giggling hysterically, "sins I've yet to commit." He flicked through the pages at random and giggled manically at something only he could see. "Although there aren't many," he cackled as he turned to the final page, tears welling in his eyes. "Just one, actually. The last one. The last sin I'll ever commit." "Grant," I said, "I think you..." Before any of us could react, he dropped the book and took a running leap over the nearest ledge. "This is the way we came." "Right." B stood at the threshold of a corridor, her light tracking a wire that snaked into the darkness. "That's the cable we carried in here with us," one of the soldiers said. "But," the young man looked over to his LT Michael, who had a compass in hand and didn't look happy. "It's not the direction we came," the older man said. "We came south, so we need to head north. That would be this doorway." He nodded at a second corridor embedded in the rock wall. "This has to be the way," B said. "I trust this cable a hell of a lot more than I do a compass. Anything could be interfering with that thing. Besides, we know the cable leads to HQ because it's still working. We spoke to them only a few minutes ago via this wire. It has to lead out of here." "That makes sense," I added, but I marked the way we left with a piece of chalk. "And that mark is over here." I pointed to a third doorway. "Fuck," Michael muttered. "Regardless, I vote wire," B said. "I trust it the most. It's a physical connection." "I guess I vote wire too," Michael added. "Me too. But what do we do if we're wrong?" I asked. "What does that even mean? Did something move the wire? Or the door?" We all went silent for a few moments as we contemplated this. When nobody offered up an answer, I eventually grabbed my backpack and hauled it up. I guess we don't have much of a choice either way. I said. Do you think there's really a book in here for everyone? B asked, and it was the first any of us had spoken in a few hours. So far we had all been walking, fixated on the gloom ahead and behind us, watching carefully for some sign that our fevered imaginations were right to suspect something lurking in the dark. Grant seemed to think so, I said. Then what are the odds he picked his own book out? I mean, if he's right, there are, 100 billion books or so? More, I replied, if he's right about the library containing future sins as well as past. Pretty slim odds then, she added. What are you thinking? If he did find it here, I don't think it was a coincidence, she said. Up ahead, one of the soldiers came to a sudden stop, fist raised. He muttered something to the others who knelt and lifted their rifles, aiming at the dark. What is it? I asked. Don't you hear it? Michael called back. All of us stopped and listened carefully, straining to pick out some meaningful sound from the white noise of blood rushing through our ears and the thumping of our own hearts. Sure enough, it was there, a gentle rustling. Without speaking, all of us moved as quietly as we could along the corridor until we came to the source of the strange noise. A door one that hadn't been there on our way in left ever so slightly ajar. Rifle raised. One of the soldiers used his barrel to nudge it open a little farther. Oh shit, he said, his voice loud enough to send echoes down the hall. The sound came as a shock, and Michael pulled him back, ready to admonish, when we all saw what had been waiting on the other side. Another corridor, only this one had shelves lined not with books, but severed heads, desiccated, pale, and gaunt, row after row, all sitting neatly next to one another, evenly spaced, their skin paper white in the harsh glare of our lights, and all of them with cloudy eyes. And they were speaking sotto voce, little whispers. They muttered in a discord of wet lips. No breath, no lungs, only the action of rubbery jaws to sound out syllables and consonants that were lost in the rustling cacophony. The sound was horrific, wet and dry and deeply unsettling. It worked its way under my skin until I felt the strangest urge to lash out at the heads. But curiosity overrode disgust, and I approached one, wincing briefly when it fixed me with its cloudy eyes. But I didn't stop. I got close enough to see every detail of its flaking skin, its rheumy eyes glaring at me with such strange emotion. For my own sanity, I reached out and picked it up, noting with disgust how the stump of its neck left mottled brown fluid on the shelf behind. I guess I just wanted to know if it was fake, that its skin was cold and its brow furrowed with anger at my touch. And as soon as it was in the air, every other head stopped their muttering and fixed me with such foul expressions, I quickly put it back down again, relieved when the murmuring resumed. Still, its eyes did not leave me. "What the fuck?" B whispered. "What is this?" Michael asked as he scanned the upper shelves with his torch. On, and they went, as far as we could see. What the actual fuck is this? Slowly, a strange thought began to form in my mind. "Blink, if you can understand me," I said, while kneeling down to look at the head I'd picked up. Everyone else in the group suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned to see the result of my little experiment. "Blink. Okay, okay, okay," I repeated while trying to calm myself down. "Right. Once for no, twice for yes. Do you understand? Blink, blink. Right, okay, I looked to the others for suggestions when B piped up instead. Are these books a list of all our sins? Blink, blink. One book for one person? Blink, blink. So what are you? She asked, and this elicited a scathing look from the severed head. Yes or no questions, I told her. One of the soldiers, the youngest one, the one who'd helped translate the German, stepped up and spoke. Is this hell? He asked. Blink, blink. Is this your punishment? He added. Blink. If this isn't the punishment, he said, what is? All the heads stopped their muttering and began to emit the strangest noise, their faces twisting upwards and warping into grotesque parodies of joy, while their mouths moved up and down in a peculiar sort of rhythm. When I realized what they were doing, I felt a terrible sensation of cold dread creeping down my entire body. They were laughing at us. There was no door. The wire slipped through a tiny hole at the base of a wall that blocked off the corridor. All of us were stunned into silence for minutes, until at last, Michael shook himself free from the shock and issued an order. "Davies, get HQ on the line." One of the soldiers knelt down and began to remove the communication set from his backpack. Within a few seconds it was set up and he was speaking into the handset. "HQ, can you read me? Over." I can read you." "Well, I guess the wire still leads to HQ," I said. "Try checking the wall for seams," Michael told me. "See if it moves. Hidden hinges or something. I don't know." Then, turning back to the soldier with the handset, "Tell them we've encountered an obstacle and we want them to send another team in to get us. Oh, and tell them to bring explosives." "If this thing opens," I said, while running my hand along the edges. "I can't see how. It's pretty solid." Unlike every other wall we'd seen so far, this one was made of red bricks, but that didn't mean it was somehow mobile either. It seemed as sturdy as any brick wall I'd come across. "Well, it came from somewhere," B cried while trying to peer through the hole the wire disappeared through. "Damn it, I can't see anything." "HQ," the soldier said. "We're gonna need some assistance. There is an obstacle. Over." "Roger that. What's the obstacle?" A wall," he replied. "Tell the next team to bring explosives. Over." "A wall?" "Just send the team ASAP," the soldier cried. "Our way out is blocked. Over." "Well, I can confirm we are en route to your position. Just one question," HQ replied. "What's that?" "Over," the young man replied. "Why do you keep saying over?" Suddenly, the voice changed. It began to titter and giggle, at first quietly, but then louder and louder, like a mean kid laughing at a prank. The cruelty in its high-pitched voice made my skin crawl, and I was about to snatch the handset myself and begin demanding answers when there was the strangest sound. A heavy grinding, like stone turning against stone. Before I could even ask what it was, B fell backwards from where she crouched and quickly leaped up into a standing position and ran off into the dark like a maniac. The effect on the group was chilling, and I stared back at the wall, desperately trying to understand what I'd seen. "Williams, go get her!" he barked at one of the soldiers before turning to me and crying, "What the fuck is her problem?" I don't know," I stammered. "Christ," Michael hissed, before snatching the handset off the confused young soldier. "Listen," he growled into it. "I don't know who you really are, but you need to get someone in charge, right?" That sound again, loud and heavy. The grinding of heavy rocks being moved, and tiny stones came raining down in a cloud of dust. Something up there had disturbed them, and we all stood in silence as they plinked off our helmets. "Is it just me?" Michael said while looking towards the wall. "Or is it somehow closer?" "Hard to say," I replied. "I don't..." The wall moved, a sudden and terrifying lurch forwards, one that startled us all and made me trip over my own feet. Terrified, I scrambled backwards from it as fast as I could, while the handset continued to radiate that malicious laughter. "I think we need to go," I said in as calm a voice as I could manage. The wall moved again, and this time it did not stop. The young soldier with the handset did not react fast enough. It came forward so quickly that it had him within seconds and knocked him to the floor with a heavy thump. And then it rolled over him, and it was... Well, if you're anything like me, as a child, you might have wondered what happened to someone who got caught in an escalator. At the very top. I'm sure you know what I mean. Light was poor, so I still don't really understand what happened. Only that there was a lot of blood, and while it was quick, It was not quick enough, because when the wall was about halfway up his spine, I could still see the pain registering in his eyes. And that was the last impression I had before Michaela grabbed me by the collar and practically threw me back the way we came. And then we ran. Running, plodding, one foot after another. I don't know how long it went on for, but it was as if time seemed to stretch on in the way that only pain and tedium can induce. There were moments where, as I struggled to force one foot in front of the other, I wondered if I'd actually been running for days, not hours. There was no real way to mark the passage of time, only monotony. Books went by in a blur. The floor was featureless stone. The rhythmic sound of my feet lost all meaning, and behind me, the wall, ever advancing with the horrible sound of grinding rocks, promising pain and nothing else. The only thing I could actually focus on was the exhaustion, and that was self-defeating. More than a few times I wondered if I should just give up. And to this day, I still have nightmares where I am being chased down that corridor. It wasn't a quick pace, but it was quick enough, and there were no other routes except forward, and therein lay the torture of it. Behind me was death moving at a brisk jog, and ahead of me was nothing, just darkness broken by the erratic motion of a torch. And the entire time, which I would later realize was a good 2 hours, the only thing I could think was, when am I going to lose this fight? When am I going to collapse? Or give up? Imagine my relief when, up ahead, I heard a familiar voice cry out, "What is your problem, lady?" And then I saw them. The young man held Bee by her shoulders while she tried to drag him through an open door. That was when I remembered the little corridor with the severed heads. Not exactly the kind of salvation I was hoping for, but it'd have to do. Together, Michael and I grabbed both of them and threw us all through the opening. Seconds later, far too close for comfort, the entire corridor we'd been running through went pitch black. The wall overtook our positions, and we were left panting and exhausted on the floor, where thousands of severed heads looked at us in annoyance. When we looked back the way we came, we saw that nothing but pulsating flesh, a wall of it, hot and sticky and threaded with sickly blue veins. I don't know what that wall was, but something about the meat behind the stone made me think of hungry coral. "It was a fucking trap," Michael hissed as he inspected the horrible mass. "I don't know how, but we were led down the wrong path. It swapped the cables, or something. I don't know, but we were lured down there like rats." "Where's Davies?" the other soldier asked. "He's gone," Michael said. "What?" The older man gestured to the wall of meat behind us. "Whatever the fuck that thing has got him. It looked like a wall, but it could move, and it just steamrolled him. Thanks for the warning, by the way," he growled at Bee, but she showed no sign of understanding him. Instead, she was sat on the floor and shaking, clearly in a state of shock. "Where now, sir?" the remaining soldier asked, and Michael grimaced. "Where do you think?" he spat before gesturing at the route forward, the only direction that's available. The heads made for strange companions. They followed us with their eyes, but did not stop their muttering. It was grating, to say the least, a noise you could ignore for maybe an hour or so. But pretty soon, the papery rustle of their ancient lips was the only thing you could focus on, no matter how hard you tried to push it out of your head. At least navigation was simple. Forward. Only the one way to go. We walked for about 6 hours before we took our first break. The corridor was wide, but we stayed away from the heads and slept in a row, head to feet, while 2 of us stayed on watch, 6 hours each. I decided to stay up along with Michaela as Bay and the other soldier tried to rest. Bee had barely come out of shock during the journey, speaking a little towards the very end. She told us, in a broken way, what she'd seen while kneeling by the wall. "Teeth," she said, "and a face, although she wouldn't, or couldn't, elaborate on those 2 statements. I was left with the sense that she had seen something that had come damn close to leaving her completely insane. even as it was. I doubted she had a full recovery in her. She almost looked like a different woman, baggy-eyed, thinning hair. Or maybe it was just the conditions down there. Maikla didn't look great either, and I had to assume I looked pretty rough too, especially after that run. It had exhausted me, broken me. Not just the physical exertion, but the nightmare of it. The reason I'd elected to stay on watch first was because I didn't want to sleep. A part of me was worried I'd just dream about being back in that hallway, running from the moving wall, and I didn't want to revisit that place ever again, not even as a dream. There were moments where I came so close to just giving up. I don't think I'd ever really experienced despair like that before. Not the kind where you feel your knees buckling and your neck turn to rubber as your head bows. It must be what people stranded at sea feel when they lose the strength to keep treading water. So instead I stayed up and tried to ignore the muttering of the heads. Even tried talking to Maikla, but he didn't have much to say. I could tell losing Davies back in the corridor had bothered him. Hell, it bothered me and I hadn't even known the guy. But I swear to this day I can still see the look on his face as rock met flesh and his legs and hips just disappeared. In the end, I had only these kinds of thoughts for company, and lots of time, so it probably shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that I eventually fell asleep. It wasn't for long, 10 minutes at most, but it was enough time for me to wake up and see something drag the sleeping soldier's body into the darkness of the nearest shelf, his neck lolling unnaturally to one side. The movement was gentle, quiet, but clumsy too, like a child pulling a rag doll stealthily out of a toy box. I looked over to Maikla and saw he'd fallen asleep as well, so I nudged him with my foot and he woke up with a sort of lazy start, only when he looked at me, confused for a few short seconds before slowly registering the look of terror on my face. Did he seem to realize what was happening? I'm not sure what I expected him to do, really, but he was the leader and well armed, and I didn't want to be the one who had to figure out what to do next, possibly because there was a part of me tempted to just sneak off, to leave the young man to his fate, maybe even if it just meant I could survive a little bit longer. In truth, I was relieved when Maikla leapt into action immediately. I didn't want to be a coward. He jumped up and grabbed the young man's foot, and I ran over and grabbed the other leg, and together we tried to pull him back. I didn't mention it to Maikla, but the way the soldier's body felt when I grabbed it, the muscles were too relaxed, too heavy. I don't know how to explain it, but if you ever end up in the unfortunate situation of moving a corpse, you might know what I mean. A living body supports itself, a dead one. It's just meat and water and somehow feels so much heavier for it. He was dead. Still, we fought on. At some point B must have woken up, realized what was happening, and joined in. I remember her trying to reach into the shelf to grab a hold of the dead man's arm when she suddenly flew backwards, landing with a hefty thud against the shelf behind her and rocking a few of the severed heads on their little stumps. Whatever was in the dark was clearly frustrated. It wanted its next meal, and it wasn't going to let us stop it. Slowly, a long, inhuman arm reached out and took a hold of the body's groin. Its strange hand had fingers that split at the knuckle. 1, 2, 3 times. A terrifying effect, especially given how each one moved on its own. A dinner plate monster of a hand attached to a lithe and muscular forearm devoid of hair. The second I saw it reach out in my general direction, I let go of the leg and fell backwards. Maikla continued struggling for a while, even taking out a pistol and firing a few shots into the dark. But in doing so, he left only hand to cling onto his comrade's corpse and lost his grip, with almost no effort. The body disappeared into shadow, and we were suddenly down to 3. "What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?" he screamed. I wanted to say something, maybe even something to comfort him, or maybe an apology for falling asleep. But then again, he'd fallen asleep too. I didn't know what I was meant to do. I was in shock, and it was settling deep into me when B said something from where she remained on the floor. Her voice quiet but oddly insistent. "It isn't over." That hand re-emerged, carefully, deliberately. It placed itself on the floor, revealing more of the pale flesh that powered it. And then came another, and another, and then its head emerged slowly from the dark and fixed me with eyes both black, bulbous, and far too numerous for anything that can be called human. and its mouth, a beard made of dirty fingers, grey and bluish, long rancid nails, hundreds of them squirming like the mandibles of a hungry spider. Michael opened fire, but he might as well have been shooting hay for all the effect it had. The bullets struck with a wet thwop, but no actual damage. The creature knocked him aside with pure contempt and pulled the rest of itself out into the corridor, where I saw it had no legs, but instead relied on several long arms to suspend itself between the walls of the corridor like a kind of spider. One of these arms reached out and grabbed Bea, and by the time she started screaming, it was already too late. Blood trickled from her ears, and there was a sound like a branch snapping. Her entire body went limp, and the monster dropped her where she fell to the ground, her grotesque, misshapen face glaring at me with accusatory eyes. The lieutenant screamed as he fired yet again, but then that thing seized him like he was nothing but a doll and lifted him. Squeezing so tightly he dropped everything he held, his gun and torch hitting the ground with a loud rattle. "Help me," he screamed while reaching out for me to grab him. Jesus Christ. Shoot the fucking thing. I ran forward, crouching down in the hope of avoiding its many arms. Already, Michael was being squeezed so tight that blood spurted from his mouth, and I could tell that the monster was having fun, reveling in his torment. I reached out to pick the gun up from the floor as Michael let out yet another desperate, wet cry for help. But for some reason, my hand stopped mere inches away. I hesitated. Michael's blood was dripping down. I could hear the crunching of his ribs. In my most shameful moment, I grabbed the torch and ran, and Michael's cries followed me, screaming, screeching, whimpering, sounds of breaking bones and tearing paper, sounds of torture and torment that somehow seemed to last forever. I emerged from the corridor alone. It took me a few seconds of stumbling on my failing legs to realize that the monster had given up on the pursuit, and then a few seconds more for me to recognize I was back on the mezzanine, terrified and exhausted, and contemplating if it was worth trying to escape, if it meant having to spend another second alive in that place. I fell to the floor and began to sob. Maybe, I thought, it was time to take a dive off that ledge just like Grant had. What on earth are you doing here? I whipped around to see an old man in robes staring at me like an impolite intruder. Without meaning to, I began to laugh. My sanity, it was fair to say, was on its final legs. "Ooh," he said while leaning aside to get a look down the long corridor behind. "Now why did you go down there?" I wanted to answer, but couldn't quite bring myself to do anything except laugh and gasp for air. "I think you really ought to go home," he said like a teacher admonishing a child. "This place is hell," I cried while rocking back and forth on my knees. "Yes," he nodded. "Yes, good for you. This is a small part of hell, one that has a slight overlap with Earth, if I remember. I'm assuming that's how you got down here. The door. What happened to your friends, anyway?" he added. I looked back the way I came and pointed. "Oh," he sighed. "You know, I left your books out specifically so you'd find them and figure it out. And I know that bald fellow worked it out. So once you knew this place was hell, why did you waste another second sticking around?" I shrugged, not quite sure what I was meant to say to that kind of thing. "We got waylaid," I gasped, misled. "Fair enough," he replied. "Probably should have done more to make sure you got home safely. That's partly my fault, although I won't apologize. You entered this place. Didn't you see the door? What part of that was inviting? You have to take some of the blame." I wanted to mount a defense, but I didn't really have one. When it became clear the only thing I could do was sob and mutter, the old man's body language softened and he reached a hand out. "Come on, I'll take you back." "What about the demons?" I asked. The old man frowned. "Those weren't demons," he snapped. "This place is defunct. Mortal souls were meant to demonstrate repentance by wandering the near-eternal halls in search of their book. Only when they found it were they allowed to move on. Whole thing didn't quite work out. 86 quadrillion books. Takes a tad too long for the average person to find theirs. So this entire wing was abandoned, and now there are only sinners left behind." "That thing was never human," I cried while pointing at the corridor I'd emerged from. "Nobody's soul looks human," he said. like it was the most obvious thing in the world, least of all the sort of person who gets sent to hell. This isn't a place for people who eat meat on a Friday or covet their neighbor's ox. It's for the cruel and the malicious, cowards and opportunists. A lot of people in this place have souls that have more in common with anglerfish and trapdoor spiders than their fellow man. And it's not a condition that gets better after several thousand years either. The soul changes, twists, and so do their physical forms. "And what about you?" I said as I reached up and took his hand. "Why do you look so normal?" "Oh," he said as he helped me up, "that's because I built this place." And the last thing I can remember as he gripped me by the shoulder was the sudden and painful sensation of heat. We woke up in our respective quarters. We, all 6 of us. I still don't fully understand the mechanics. I tried asking the others how they made it back, but they weren't in a state to answer questions. B was catatonic, screaming and clutching her head in the hospital, like she still remembered the way that thing crushed her skull like a grapefruit. The soldier who fell to the wall was left paraplegic, even though medical tests couldn't identify a single reason why. Psychological, they said. The other soldier, the one who'd been dragged into the shelves, was comatose. I don't know if he recovered, but he was alive, and Grant was left in a permanent psychotic state, compelled to write on any surface he could over and over again, sin after sin, desperately trying to rewrite the very book that had driven him to madness in the first place. Michael tried very hard to kill me. He had clear memories of being left to die in the dark. I'm glad they caught him before he managed to wring the life out of me with his bare hands. I never found out what happened to him after several men managed to pry his hands from around my throat. Despite everything, I hope he managed some kind of recovery. The door disappeared, thankfully with no one on the other side. I know they were planning future expeditions. It is for the best that kind of thing can't happen again. They have no idea what's waiting for them. In a way, I probably could have convinced myself the expedition never happened. Some days, even now, that's what I sincerely hope can happen. There was no physical evidence. Nothing. We appeared in our beds completely naked, save for a note stuck to my chest. And it's this final little touch that stood out to me as stern confirmation of everything I'd experienced. Return to sender. 6 mortals. 5 were damaged in transit. Bodies were repaired to the best of my ability. But I never was any good at that kind of thing. Minds are another matter entirely. Could not help myself in one case. Left fellow mortal to die in the dark. Didn't seem very sporting. Don't let anyone say I lack a sense of humor. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. Best wishes. Me. My heart sank when I heard them read it to me. It confirmed my deepest worries. No one had been very honest with me since I'd arrived at the hospital. They'd kept me bandaged up so it wasn't easy to tell. But after I heard that note, I finally found the courage to reach up and remove the thick wads of fabric. Then with shaking fingers, I finally touched my eyes. Or rather, the empty sockets where they used to be. I've loved going to garage and estate sales since I was a kid. Every item being sold has a story connected to it, and I love discovering what might be hiding behind people's unwanted junk. From grandfather clocks to old military uniforms, to even a nearly mint condition Model T that someone's relative had kept secret from the family. I've found hundreds of items like that. So when one day I came upon a small neighborhood garage sale that was going on, without skipping a beat, I pulled my car into this foreign neighborhood and quickly began searching around for items. I found the usual odd knickknacks that most people try to get rid of. Clothes, old electronics, and the odd piece of furniture. I bought a few items here and there, but nothing was standing out to me. That was until I came upon an elderly woman sitting in front of her house with a few items laid out before her. She smiled as I walked over to her and struck up a conversation with her, and began to show me a few items that she was selling. I probably don't have to tell you, guys, how big of a jackpot old people are when it comes to interesting old items. She began to tell me how she was about to move into a nursing home, and that she was having to give up a few items she wasn't able to take with her. I nodded at her and began to peruse her items as we continued our conversation. She had plenty of interesting items from her family's history, but one item especially caught my eye. A weathered old journal that was tightly tied up with a leather strap and with what looked like photos sticking out of it. I picked it up and examined it for a moment. I didn't want to be rude and open it in front of her, so I asked her about the book. She took it from me and did her best to try and look at it through her impressively thick glasses. But it looked just as foreign to her as it was to me. With this leather-wrapped mystery secured, I gave the old woman who was named Margaret my number in case anything came from this journal. And with childlike giddiness, I quickly headed home to examine my find. The first thing I examined was a photo that greeted me the moment I opened the journal. It was a weathered old photo of 5 heavily jacketed men in what looked like a great white void. Flipping the photo over, I was met with a strange inscription that confused me at first. Antarctic Expedition, July 1930. Now, I don't claim to be an Antarctic expert, but I'd never heard of any expedition in the 1930s. A quick Google search did indeed show me that Admiral Richard E. Byrd did indeed have an expedition to Antarctica in 1930. But before I got my hopes up, I noticed that no one in that photo resembled Byrd at all. In fact, the date on the photo was dated to a month after Byrd's expedition had gone back home. I plucked another photo from the journal and found another copy of the 5 men. This one was labelled with the names of the men in the photo: Professor Albert Woodring, Niels Bergsvik, Olaf Hustad, Jesse Wallace, and Henry Perkins. With names now attached to these mystery explorers, I started my search for them, but to my annoyance, I found nothing connected to these men. Even the professor's name revealed nothing to me. Thinking that maybe this was all just a hoax or some elaborate setup for some sort of story, I decided to crack open the journal and actually read it. It became apparent that the journal belonged to Henry Perkins and that he was a student at a university, though he neglected to ever name which one he was from. Much of the early journal is a setup toward the expedition to the Antarctic. Apparently, 3 Americans, including the professor and Henry, would be accompanied by 2 Norwegians who were hired to ensure that the group didn't get themselves killed in the sub-zero temperatures of Antarctica. They were taking a small team to get them to Antarctica and set up a base camp. From there, the 5 men would travel over the Transantarctic mountains and out onto the great vast emptiness of Antarctica. One early entry in the journal did draw my attention. However, March 17th, 1930, I spoke with Professor Woodring today about the finances regarding this expedition. This amount of equipment is sure to be costing both him and the university a small fortune. Not only is a team of sled dogs to accompany us and provisions to be supplied for up to 3 years on the continent, but even a radio and wireless telegraph machine is to be brought for the purpose of this expedition. I would venture to guess that this would rival even Admiral Byrd's expedition, but the professor has kept tight-lipped about where all this money is coming from. He spoke only vaguely of a French nobleman who is paying for most, if not all, of our expenditures. Perkins seemed as skeptical as I was upon reading this. These things were expensive as hell during the time, especially during the Great Depression, which even Perkins calls attention to in several entries. What was most alarming was the fact of how secret the professor was being about the expedition. He hadn't even brought this up with anyone but the men who were to join him on this expedition. In all, by the time the boat set off for Antarctica, only 30 men had been chosen for the journey. This was all starting to feel like the beginning of a movie, and my doubts were starting to grow. But I was enthralled by Perkins' writing. Despite the strange and dubious circumstances surrounding this strange expedition, he was thrilled to be a part of it. His pages are filled with how happy he is to be away from university and out to mark his name into history. The boat was named SS Firefly and arrived off the coast of Antarctica after a smooth month of sailing. Perkins' excitement was evident in his writing. June 27th, 1930. At long last we've arrived at our destination. The great vast white land is before us, and I've never been more excited. I'm about to walk where only a few brave men have walked before. The men are all giddy with excitement, and I'm along with them. Though Professor Woodring seems slightly muted in his excitement, but I suppose a Great War veteran would be hard to impress. With the group arriving at the continent, they began the task of unloading the Firefly and beginning to create their base camp near the base of Mammt. Erebus, which they named Atlas Camp. I thought that was a little funny. The titan that holds up the world. The rest of June and most of July was spent with the group of men continuing to build up the base camp of Atlas. All the while they began to deal with heavy windstorms and blizzard-like conditions. Perkins, though, seemed undaunted by it all, and had even struck up a friendship with one of the Norwegian Niles. The two of them bonding over their shared passion for art. The two of them even exchanged sketches of each other, which I found tucked away in one of the pages of the journal. Soon the base camp was at last completed, and the men hunkered down waiting for the Antarctic winter to pass them by. I was surprised to find out from both this book and a quick Google to confirm that winter in Antarctica lasts from March to October. Perkins included several photos of the team living at the base camp and enjoying their company while they waited out the winter. From Perkins' journal, it appeared that morale stayed high throughout the winter. They made sure the sled dogs were taken care of, and Perkins and the other student Jesse Wallace helped Professor Woodring collect various samples and fossils that they had discovered in the construction of Atlas. It all seemed to be going quite well for the men. That was until a strange incident occurred, just as winter was giving way to summer. I'll let Perkins describe it for you. September 27th, 1930. The most peculiar incident has occurred that has left many of us stumped and confused. Last night, while I was up late taking some notes on a trilobite fossil that Jesse had discovered, I heard a loud and sickening crash on the roof of our cabin. The noise was so great that it woke almost everyone instantly. Olaf and Niles were quick to their feet and quickly grabbed their shotguns from the wall near their bed. I had to be on hand to stop anyone from going outside until dawn, for in these sub-zero temperatures and without any natural light, we were liable to become lost in the storm that was at present attacking us. When morning at last came, we all ventured out to see what the noise had been. None of us had gotten much sleep since the anticipation and the mystery had prevented any of us from falling asleep. Climbing up onto the roof, we were met with a truly peculiar sight. A dead emperor penguin was waiting for us, flouncing stiff as a board on the roof. Embedded into its skin were several deep claw marks, and even more puzzling was the fact that it looked like the penguin had been dropped from a great distance onto our roof, almost like it had been in mid-flight before suddenly dropping dead on top of our cabin. Professor Woodring was just as puzzled as we were. He had no explanation for it, and we came up with several possible theories, though none of them were very convincing. Perhaps a great wind had picked up the injured penguin and dropped it on top of us, or perhaps some great condor had been blown off course and had dropped its meal in an attempt to escape the biting cold of the continent. None of these theories are very concrete, but it's an absolute mystery as to how this flightless bird had somehow achieved flight. This puzzled me, as well as there was no plausible way for the penguin to have ended up splatting on the top of Perkins' cabin. Unfortunately, Perkins didn't include a photo of the penguin, so I had to take his word of the incident. However, the penguin incident was quickly forgotten once October dawned, and at long last, summer arrived on the continent, and our 5 heroes got ready to go out and explore what lay over the mountains. October 4th, 1930. At long last we set off from Atlas. With a cheer and wishes of good luck, we left on foot and skies with plenty of food and camping materials. The plan is to get over the mountains and build a temporary camp. Once the camp is built, one of us university students and a Norwegian will be sent back to gather more supplies and hopefully more men to further build up a base camp across the mountains. Supplies will be sparse, so it is hoped that we can complete our mission before the start of next winter. God willing, everything will go well. I am hopeful and full of excitement. Our journey into the unknown begins at last. Their journey got off to a well enough start. However, hauling that many supplies over mountains proved to be harder than they were expecting it to be, and they barely managed to cover 3 miles a day over the mountain ranges. Several times they nearly lost a sled to the steep mountain edges. Perkins remained optimistic, but even he was starting to question whether doing this had been a good idea when they had sled dogs available. But he comforted himself in thinking that they wouldn't have had a much better time going over the mountains. It took most of the month, but close to the end of October, in joyful excitement, Perkins declared, October 28th, 1930, at long last. We are past the mountains. I must confess that at times I felt like turning back and giving up this journey as lost. But as I lowered my goggles and face shield and looked out upon the great snow desert, it felt as if it had all been worth it. Once we were some miles away from the mountains, we began to set up our first semi-permanent camp. We haven't bothered to name this one yet, as we don't plan on staying too long. This camp would act as a sort of supply dump for our return trip, and for anyone who decided to go looking for us in case we went missing out here. I am overjoyed to be a part of this expedition, and even Professor Woodring has been smiling at long last. I believe that we are in good hands out here. They stayed at this temporary camp until the 1st of November, before continuing their trek out into the Great White Desert. As opposed to their slow going over the mountains, they picked up speeds over the vast emptiness of Antarctica. One day they recorded going over 15 miles before making camp. Up till this point, I had been so preoccupied with the enjoyment of this reading that I had failed to ask myself what the point of this expedition was. They obviously weren't heading for the South Pole, as they had gone east from Mount Erebus over the mountain ranges and into an area near Victoria Land. So what was the point of this trip? Perkins seemed confused as well, when at last, in a surprising turn of events, Professor Woodring decided to make camp in the middle of nowhere, some 200 or so miles from their first camp past the mountain ranges. November 17th, 1930, Professor Woodring has triumphantly proclaimed our base to be named Kronos. I must confess that I was shocked when he ordered us to begin setting up our permanent base here, seemingly in the middle of this vast waste without any indication as to why. As Olaf and I were pitching our tent, the Norwegian asked me what the point of this expedition even was. And to my surprise, I, myself, had no idea. I told him some vague answers about samples and fossils before quickly changing to subject to his family. Later, once our mini tent city was set up, I pulled Jesse aside and asked him if he had any clue as to the origin of our expedition. And to my surprise and shock, he had been wondering if I knew the reason for it. That night, we entered Professor Woodring's tent and asked to be given the information to the meaning of this expedition. He looked at us for a moment or two before producing a letter from his trunk and handing it to us. It was a letter from the French nobleman who had financed such an expensive expedition, one Henri Leblanc, Count Vermandois. The letter instructed Professor Woodring to lead this expedition to Antarctica in search of signs of living creatures this deep into the interior. We both stared at him in absolute disbelief. There's no way that anything could survive here in the interior of Antarctica, with these horrific temperatures and lack of a food source. Professor Woodring understands this and is with us in believing it. But who is he to turn down a stupid Frenchman's money to finance a dream expedition? I'm left conflicted. It is true that without this nobleman's money, we wouldn't now be here. But does he truly expect us to find anything out here? Perkins doesn't write for the next few days, which is surprising to me, as up to that point, he had been consistently writing at least little updates for the days in which nothing happens. But for a solid week, he says nothing at all. But a week later, his entry begins with the most ominous sentence I've ever read. November 24th. 1930. There's something out there. Perkins' handwriting in this passage is notably much worse than it normally is. It started 6 days ago, after we had just confronted Professor Woodring about the nature of this expedition. We were perplexed to find that there was a newly dug ditch in the snow. We were confused as none of us had dug it, and it appeared as though something had emerged from under it. Grabbing shovels, we began to dig it out, and we were shocked to discover several large objects buried in the snow. We picked a few of them up and examined them. They appeared to be large, almost fossilized eggs. We believed that they may be dinosaur eggs of some kind, and thought for a moment that perhaps that crazy Frenchman had been correct. Our moment of happiness was very short-lived. That night, while we were celebrating our discovery, a sudden blizzard descended upon us. We were all confined to our heated tents to wait out the storm. It must have been close to midnight when, through the howling wind, I thought I heard someone screaming. I thought at first it was the wind, but in between gusts of wind I for sure heard blood-curdling screams. Acting quickly, I threw on my jackets and mittens and grabbed my kerosene lamp from its post. Running outside in the whipping blizzard, I struggled to see even a few inches from my face. Stumbling around in the darkness, I stumbled upon Olaf's tent, and to my horror discovered it ripped to shreds, and there, shivering uncontrollably and bleeding to death, was Olaf, a look of absolute terror on his face. I quickly grabbed him and started screaming to the other members. They all quickly exited their tents and stared in horror at what was lying before them. Olaf looked almost as if he had been mauled, but a bear and his tent, built to withstand blizzard-strength winds, had been knocked over and ripped to shreds. We quickly dragged Olaf into my tent and began warming him up and treating his severe wounds. He began babbling in Norwegian, and Niles did his best to comfort his fellow countrymen. By some miracle, we managed to stop his bleeding and wrap his more serious wounds with gauze and bandages. I was completely taken aback by this. Just a few days ago, the men had been in such high spirits, but now, out of nowhere, something had attacked them, and as I turned the page, I was greeted with photos of the aftermath. Olaf's tent, shredded and destroyed, and almost completely buried in snow, and Olaf himself, bandaged and placed in a sleeping bag to keep him warm and alive in Perkins' tent. Perkins' entry continued. Niles has taken to carrying his shotgun everywhere he goes, and I believe that to be a smart decision. We also decided to sleep two in a tent, with Niles and me taking care of Olaf, and Jesse and the professor staying in their tent to make sense of what had attacked Olaf. He soon began to experience intense pain, and we had to keep him injected with morphine to keep him from crying out in pain. We racked our brains trying to imagine what had attacked him that night. But we didn't have to wait long to figure it out. Yesterday, as I was getting ready to write in my journal again, Niles asked me to take a walk with him. I left Olaf in the care of Jesse, while the professor continued to examine the eggs that we had discovered. Walking with Niles, he began to press me for more information on what our mission out here was. Feeling that he should know, I told him what the professor had told me. Niles' mind quickly went to the idea of some beast attacking the camp. But I couldn't believe that. I clung to the belief that nothing could survive this deep into the continent. Penguins and seals lived only very close to the coast, and there was no way that anything like that could survive here. As we continued to walk and discuss with each other, Niles took a step forward, and suddenly, in a blink of an eye, something emerged from beneath the snow and bit down on his leg with a loud and sickening crunch. Niles let out a scream and dropped his shotgun into the snow. He screamed and shouted in Norwegian as whatever was underneath the snow began pulling him down into it. In a blind panic, I quickly grabbed the shotgun from underneath the snow, aimed it down into the snow, and fired. A horrifying screech bellowed out from the snow as suddenly something shot out from underneath it and covered me and Niles in rock-hard snow and ice. By the time we were able to get our bearing, whatever it was had disappeared. Perkins included photos of the nasty bites that Niles had gotten and the crater where the creature had seemingly been waiting for them. He also included sketches of the eggs, which the professor had told him could not be photographed yet. Perkins' long entry ended with this haunting passage. There's something out there, and it's hunting us. We need to get Olaf and Niles medical attention, or they will die here. I plan on telling the professor tomorrow, and if he doesn't agree, I'll have to convince Jesse to come with me. I'm not going to die here in this god-forsaken place. The next entry was dated 2 days later and was no less horrifying. November 26th, 1930, Professor Woodring is dead. I confronted him on the 25th as I said I would. I demanded that we be allowed to return to Atlas Base with Olaf and Niles. Otherwise they would die from gangrene, infection, or exposure. He refused, telling me that the eggs that we believed to be fossilized were in fact living eggs. Despite this shocking discovery, I was unmoved and demanded that we return to Atlas. Again, I was ignored. I left his tent to inform Jesse of my plan. As I left the tent, I heard a strange buzzing noise, almost like that of a mosquito. Only it continued to grow louder by the second until a loud crash sounded behind me from the professor's tent. Looking back in horror, I was met by an enormous beast. It must have been nearly 8 feet tall and walked on 6 spindly-like legs. It was covered in a coat of white coarse fur and flashing its antennae at me. On its rear was a large stinger, and attached to its body were 2 pairs of wings. It screeched loudly at me and was enough to draw Jesse out of his tent, shotgun in hand and a look of horror in his eyes. From underneath his destroyed tent, Professor Woodring cried out to us, begging for our help and ordering us to kill the creature. Jesse quickly aimed and fired at the creature. It let out some more screeches before it dug its legs into the tent and used its front legs to grab onto Professor Woodring and fly away with him, kicking up a torrent of snow and carrying the screaming and crying professor away into the ether. Included in the following pages were sketches that showed what the creature looked like. It appeared to be like a giant furry bug with a scorpion-like stinger on it, and to my disgust, it had an almost human-like face to it, though one that was heavily insectoid nonetheless. Perkins' entry continues. Me and Jesse have decided to load Olaf and Niles onto our sleds and begin the journey back to Atlas. Kronos must be abandoned, and whatever is out there must not be allowed to kill all of us. God willing, we'll be able to make it back safely. Perkins' next few entries are not dated, and they become increasingly hard to read. I've done my best to translate them here, but know that some of I've had to guess as the quality has deteriorated. December, illegible, 1930. The creature attacked us last night. Fought it off with a few shotgun shots. Olaf's conditioning is worsening, fading in and out of consciousness, a struggle to keep him warm. Niles' leg recovered enough to continue walking on foot and help us pull sleds. We believe the creature is following us. December 4th or 5th, 1930, we made the painful decision to abandon Olaf. He has lapsed into unconsciousness, and we believe that the scent of his blood is allowing the creature to track us. We left him behind and used the last of the morphine to further sedate him. I pray that it takes him when he is sleeping. We still have several hundred miles still to go till we reach the mountains. We hope that without Olaf we can make up time. December 7th or 8th, 1930. This morning, a dreadful blizzard attacked us. Jesse suggested we make camp, but Niles and I argued for continuing forward, banking on the fact that perhaps the creature would lose track of us if we continued our march through the blizzard. Jesse wasn't convinced but continued along anyway. By the time the storm at last died down, all of us were showing signs of frostbite, and Niles has begun to develop snow blindness. December, illegible, 1930. The creature hides itself under the snow. As we set up camp to continue on our journey, Jesse was leading the way as we continued to pull the sled, and as he stepped forward, the creature suddenly burst forth from underneath the snow and took a hold of his leg. Acting quickly, Niles raised his shotgun and blasted the creature in the face, sending it scurrying back under the snow. Unfortunately, it took Jesse's foot with it. We bandaged it up as best we could and loaded him onto the sled, but I would be lying if I said I believed that he will make it. The creature almost seems to swim through the snow like some sort of snow nymph. This next section had no date, but I believe it to be a few days after this attack. Jesse has been crying and screaming for hours as we continue to march toward the mountains, without any morphine to treat him. The only time he's able to keep his mouth shut is when the pain becomes too much and he faints. Niles is not in any better condition. The bite marks on his legs have become infected, and his strength is decreasing as the days continue. I've had to contend with the idea of continuing on my own into the vast emptiness to hopeful safety. January, illegible, 1931. We reached the mountains at last. Unfortunately, the creature hasn't stopped its relentless attacks on us. Just last night I had to use the last of the shotgun shells to drive it away. All I'm left with is my ice axe and a revolver that I salvaged from the professor's tent. It has 4 bullets in it, and me and Niles decided to put Jesse out of his misery. I couldn't bring myself to do it, so I had Niles do it. We loaded what little food and gas we had left, and began our trek into the mountains. January 10th, 1931. Niles is dead. He went as far as he could, but at last, the infection caught up with him and his snow blindness as well. I stayed with him through the night in our bivouac as he slowly drifted away. He told me stories of his childhood and his wife, before at last his voice grew faint and he finally ceased to be. His last words were in Norwegian, and unfortunately, I cannot repost them here. We started with 5 and now I am alone. Along with this entry, there was a simple sketch of a grave that Perkins made for Niles out of his skies and equipment. The last few entries are barely coherent and point to the fact that at this point, Henry Perkins was at his breaking point. At this point, he'd probably reached his breaking point long ago, but it was finally catching up with him. His next few entries are not dated and are nearly impossible to read, but what few passages I could read I'll relay here. Creature attacked again, stung with its stinger, managed to hit with ice axe, cut off one of its antennae, saving bullets. Pain is unbearable, must keep going. Creature uses antennae to sense when something is near, saw them sticking out of snow, managed to avoid it. I believe I'm lost. Blizzard is upon me, bivouacked in place, can hear it near me. Blizzard continues. Food has run out. Blizzard continues. The next several pages are completely illegible. Blizzard has let up. Can see camp from where I am. Can no longer move my legs. The creature is waiting outside. His final entry is heartbreaking, knowing how close he was to Atlas camp and just how far he'd made it by himself. Fired several shots at the creature. It screamed, ran away, left behind an egg. It's a female, I believe. I wonder if anyone heard my shots. I believe I'll rest a moment before trying to move my legs again. Just a small rest. And with that, his entries end, and I'm left conflicted. I still have trouble finding this all believable. How did this journal end up in an old lady's garage sale if it sounded like Henry Perkins passed away just within sight of Atlas Base? I contacted Margaret and told her about the contents of the journal. To my surprise and horror, she suddenly remembered something. Her great-grandfather had told her once of how he'd been a part of an Antarctic expedition. She invited me back to her house to examine a few of his items that she still possessed. True to her word, she produced several photos of him from the expedition. It appeared that he had been one of the men to help build and maintain Atlas Base, while Perkins and the others went on their ill-fated journey. The two of us figured that after Perkins had fired those shots, her great-grandfather and a few men went to see where it had happened and came upon Perkins' body. He then took the journal and returned to the States. So there's no doubt about the validity of this story. To my surprise, while searching for any other connections to this story, I was put into contact with one Jackson LeBlanc, a descendant of Henri LeBlanc, who had financed the expedition, and he's made it known how excited he is to buy this journal off of me, for whatever price I deem fit. I plan on meeting him in person tomorrow, and I'm sure he'll be more than excited to see that his ancestor had indeed been right. Something was living in the Antarctic. Maybe there still is. But that's the end of my story. I told you, you do find those nuggets of gold in garage sales after all. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.